Okay, so smile, you're on camera. Cool, we'll hit a couple of the past slides and then we'll turn it over to you. So welcome everybody. This is the HADR virtual chapter for March 2015. Just have a handful of slides from our parent organization, PASS. So first of all, we have the Business Analytic Conference coming up next month. We have a $150 off registration code here, BAVCHA. Please register today. It is an outstanding conference. We do have a lot of other virtual chapters available for you. I personally do a lot with the virtualization, the HADR, and the performance ones, but there are some phenomenal ones with business development, performance, PowerShell, you name it, there's a virtual chapter for you. They generally meet once a month. They're free. They're also recorded if you can't make them, so sign up for them. We have a number of other virtual chapter meetings coming up soon. So I know we've data science, virtualization, professional development, a lot of great topics. So if you're not familiar with SQL Saturdays, they're one-day free events generally on Saturday all over the world. So coming up, we've got Richmond, Virginia, Silicon Valley, Madison, Wisconsin, Huntington Beach, Boston, Ottawa, and a number overseas there as well. Check them out. There's guaranteed to be one near you at some point soon, so check them out. PASS would not exist without all of the volunteer help from this wonderful community. Please volunteer today, volunteer.sqlpass.org, and if you're on the site, you can go under the My Volunteering section of your MyPass profile and sign up and see what some of your options are. So as you all know, this is part of PASS. It's free membership. You get involved with the community. You get to know and get to be aware of a lot of the upcoming events. They're on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and at sqlpass.org. So today's speaker is Kendra Little from Brent Ozar Unlimited, talking about SQL Server and Quorum configuration for clustering for failover clusters and for availability groups. So I'm going to change that over to Kendra, and I'll let you get rolling.
All right, thanks so much, David. All right, so I'm going to get the screen shared and the slides up here. Rearrange my webcam so that I can see myself. It's always good to see a person when you're presenting, even if it's yourself. It's one of those weird little things. All right, cool. All right, hey folks. So there's a chat window and like a Q&A. So this is just the initial test. I think you should be able to see the slides. So if one of you can type into the chat window, I can see the slides. That lets me know that you're awake and that the slides are actually working. We did test this out ahead of time, but of course, yes. Hi, so I got a hi from Kat. Thanks, Kat. Welcome to How to Configure Quorum in SQL Server. My name is Kendra Little, and I work with Quorum with folks a lot, and making sure to configure it properly is one of the important things to do. Let's see if I can actually get my slides to advance. There we go. It's one of the really important things to do when you're thinking about setting up high availability in SQL Server. What we're going to cover today is a quick overview of the types of Quorum that I'm talking about. I'm talking about failover clusters and availability groups. Give you a brief overview of just what is it, what are these features called dynamic quorum and dynamic witness, and some guidelines. Okay, for 3 real-world scenarios, how would you configure quorum and why? So that's what we'll be covering today. Here is a diagram of a failover cluster. Now, we've had failover clusters for SQL Server for quite a while, so I kind of think that this is like a classic old friend. This picture shows their shared storage, and we've got 2 physical server nodes and 1 SQL Server instance. And that SQL Server instance, the databases on there are on that storage that both nodes can access. And the SQL Server instance can be active on SQL CLU01 node 01 here, or it can be active on node 2. The system databases, the user databases, the logins, all that stuff moves with the clustered instance. And we've had this for quite some time. And Windows provides this failover cluster functionality where it uses Quorum to decide, okay, where is our SQL Server instance online, and is it safe to have it online at all? We have a new functionality in SQL Server called an availability group. And an availability group lets us do something a little bit different. It also uses the Windows clustering feature, but now we actually can use individual storage. So in this diagram, one of the differences is that the storage is actually in these individual servers, and each of them has its own copy of the database. I like to think of availability groups as like database mirroring, getting married with Windows Failover Clustering and then going off and having crazy, insane adventures together, because the Windows cluster is involved with figuring out where are the databases writable and is it safe to have them online too. So when you're working with availability groups, you're also working with the Windows Failover Clustering feature, just in a different way than you are with a traditional failover cluster instance. Now these things can be combined too. So you can have, in this picture, we have a Windows Failover Cluster instance. That's the blue one at the top with the shared storage. But then we've also added in an availability group replica to the family too. So you can actually combine these things. They're all part of the same Windows Failover Cluster. The Windows Failover Cluster knows about all three of these nodes, and it helps SQL Server figure out where it's safe to be online. The method of figuring out is it safe to be online, how do you configure and influence that? You do that by setting up what's called Quorum. And you configure Quorum in the Failover Cluster Manager. So we're at the Windows Start menu here, and the Failover Cluster Manager is where you set that up. And when you think about Quorum, what's Quorum? Quorum is all about voting. It's about having the members of the cluster vote to say, is it safe to have the SQL Server online, and where should it be writable? Things like that. This is a picture of the Failover Cluster Manager on Windows Server 2012 R2. And they've added, as you'll see, Windows version matters. They've added a lot of features over time. And this shows, I've got the nodes highlighted here. This shows that on the nodes, right, so we've got this clicked on here, which is why we see these two guys here. My cluster has two nodes. One is named ToInstances01. One is named ToInstances02. They both have a status of up, and they both have an assigned vote of 1. So those are my nodes, and they're up, and they're voting on my cluster. And part of what you see is really specific to the operating system version. You wouldn't see this exact same view on something like Windows Server 2008 R2, for example. Here's just a quick scenario. We have a 2-node availability group. And just let's say it's in a Windows Server 2008 R2 failover cluster. So on kind of an older version of the operating system. Now, ToInstances01 is where the availability group is read-write. And we're just using ToInstances02 to be able to fail over. If ToInstances01 has a problem, we're going to do automatic failover to ToInstances02 and be online there. So ToInstances02 is just playing the role of secondary. The failover cluster helps us avoid situations like this, because what would happen if SQL Server thought it could write to both instances at the same time, the same databases on both instances? It would be really, really cool if that worked and that we could have multiple writable versions of the same database, but we actually don't have a feature for that. If that were to occur with an availability group, we would get data corruption. The only way that SQL Server can have essentially the same database be writable on multiple SQL servers is to use peer-to-peer replication, which is a totally different functionality. It's also an Enterprise Edition feature, which Availability Groups does as well. And it requires schema changes. It's a use of replication. Very, very different. It doesn't involve the failover cluster like we're talking about here. For the purposes of availability groups, we have to make sure that we aren't corrupting the data by making databases writable in more than one place, because we can only have one writable copy of a database at one time. And the cluster has to help us make sure that we're online in the right place. So let's say with our 2-node availability group, they each have 1 vote. And we haven't configured any witness, which you'll learn about in a little bit. We haven't configured any 3rd vote. We just have the 2 nodes. Well, they're both online, and they go through a process of saying, okay, well, I'm counting my own vote, I have a vote, but then they look at the other members of the cluster and say, how many other votes do I see? We have a total of 2 votes in the cluster, And as long as each node can see the other node, they say, yep, we've got 2 out of 2 votes. That is a majority. Everything is fine. But what happens if there's an issue? Let's say there's a network issue, and ToonSys01 actually can't see ToonSys02, and ToonSys02 can't see ToonSys01. Well, they go through this process of vote counting. And now ToonSys01 says, well, I have 1 vote. There's 2 votes total, but I actually don't see anyone else. 1 out of 2 is not a majority. ToonSys02 says the same thing. There's 2 total votes. I have 1 vote, but I cannot see the other. 1 is not a majority of 2. It's only 50%, and 50% is not a majority. Each node is concerned that the SQL Server might be up on the other node, right? If I'm ToonSys01 in this situation, how do I know that ToonSys02 isn't somehow live? And in this case, the cluster service has to really worry and say, I'm not really sure. I mean, you could have even forced SQL Server up on that other node. Like, I don't know. I need, in order for safety, if I do not have a majority, I need to be offline because I do not have enough information to know that it's safe to be online. And in this case, we're not online anywhere, which this isn't a particularly attractive situation, right? We have a cluster because we want high availability, not services to be offline. So for this reason, we want to make sure that we are likely to have a majority somewhere. And for this reason, we have a functionality called a witness. And we don't necessarily have to add a 3rd server. We can use up to 1 witness per cluster and use a witness that also can have a vote. And that witness is it makes it an odd number. So if I have a total of 3 votes, an odd number, I'm more likely to be able to have a better way to keep my quorum if there's just a network interruption between the 1 nodes, because maybe ToonSys02, maybe somebody just reboots it by accident, or it just has its own internal issue, right? I want ToonSys01 to be able to survive then. Our options for setting this up vary a lot, and your Windows version really, really matters. Here's a chart laying out some changes in failover clustering over time. There's different features for configuring quorum. So node weight. Node weight is a really important thing. There might be times when you don't want a node to be able to vote. Maybe the node is in an unreliable location and you're only going to fail over to it manually. There's network blips that happens at that location. Do you want it to participate in the voting? In Windows Server 2008 R2, you can configure this if you use a hotfix. It is built into the tool. You also have to use PowerShell. In later versions of Windows, they've added this into the failover cluster feature itself. We have the option to have a file share witness in all of them, but this one's really, really cool, and I'm going to show you more about actually dynamic quorum and dynamic witness. Dynamic quorum was added in Windows Server 2012, and the idea is that, let's say I start my cluster out with 5 votes. And 1 node is offline, and it's going to be offline for a long period. I haven't removed it from the cluster, but it's just offline. Should we keep that vote count at 5, or should we reduce it? And it lets Windows decide what to do with vote count based on the total number of available voters. Now, as you'll see, this is pretty tricky depending on the type of failure that happens, but the important thing to know is that Windows is smarter about figuring out what do I want my vote count to be based on the number of members of nodes and whether or not they're online. Similarly, dynamic witness is a feature that helps it figure out, should I use this witness vote or not? And again, it can be tricky. We'll dig in a little bit more into that. We've also got things like tiebreakers, and I have to say, I mean, Windows Server 2012 is good, but I actually, for usability purposes, I love the fact that we did get the start menu back in Windows Server 2012 R2. Who doesn't love that, right? So let's dig in a little more and take a look at dynamic quorum. Here's our example again of what if we have 2 nodes and we have not configured a witness. Now, this is not ideal, right? But this is just kind of, okay, well, how does dynamic quorum work? we have 2 nodes, and with dynamic quorum, which starts in Windows Server 2012 R2, the cluster is like, okay, that's not an odd number. That is not ideal. I want an odd number. So it can actually look at these nodes and dynamically say, you've each been assigned a vote in quorum configuration, but dynamically, I'm going to take one of your votes away and set it to 0. You can actually see this, and I'll show you how to see it in the Cluster Quorum Manager. But first, how do you even set it up? So the topic of this talk is how to configure quorum, so I should show you how would I'm not saying this is a good setup, but how would I even set this up in SQL Server? How this is a mistake you might make in setting it up this way. Here's the Failover Cluster Manager for my cluster, and my cluster is named Cluster 01. So up here at the top, you can see that it's Cluster 01. It isn't a domain. You have to have a domain to do a cluster. This is just in a little test environment on my laptop. I have a small domain controller. There are 2 virtual machines that are members of this cluster. So I have 3 virtual machines making this laptop, or making this availability group. It's all in a laptop in a domain. So that's my cluster. And there's not a lot that's been going on here. I do not have a witness configured, and you can see that right in there at the top. Notice that there's no big warning sign there, which I'm kind of like, yeah, I wish it was kind of warning me about that, but it's not. Over here in the right menu, on the Actions menu, there is something that says More Actions, right? So way over here on the right menu, there's More Actions, and I'm zooming in over there. If you look at More Actions, there's one thing that says Configure Cluster Quorum. This can also be done in PowerShell. This is just how to do it in the Failover Cluster Manager. And when you click that, it opens up the Configure Cluster Quorum wizard, which is really cool, makes it really easy to set up this configuration. And here's how people end up accidentally with the 2 nodes and nothing else. The default cluster quorum configuration sounds really good. Like, okay, I'll go ahead and use the default. What could go wrong, right? So I'll use the default. And it says, okay, well, the defaults are you have 2 nodes in your availability group and you haven't configured a witness, so here you go. And it does try to point out that as a best practice, you should configure a witness, but it doesn't really color, it's not red. This is how folks end up with this configuration. Read these messages carefully, and if they mention there's a best practice that you're not following, it's probably not such a great idea. But in my case, I don't know better, so I click Next and I finish, and that's how I end up with 2 nodes and no witness. And notice here, I've highlighted, we're on the Nodes button again. I'm looking at the nodes, and I really love that they've added this feature to Windows 2012 R2. I get to see what is the current vote for each node. Toonces 02 has a node weight of 0 because the cluster wants an odd number of votes. It's worried about that scenario I showed you earlier where each node had 1 vote and they couldn't see one another. So it says, okay, well, I will give the vote to Toonces 01. Toonces 02 doesn't have the vote. If someone powers down Toonces 01, Windows Start menu shut down, it will attempt to hand off the vote to Toonces 02. Because when Windows is shutting down, the cluster can actually do activities in a planned way, right? And there's something I want you to notice about this picture. Toonces 01 has the vote, but the availability group is currently hosted on Toonces 02. On my Nodes menu, I have highlighted Toonces 02, and down here it's showing you that AG01 is actually running on Toonces 02. So the node that has the vote is not necessarily the node where your SQL Server instance is running. It doesn't have logic to think about that and make sure of that. It's just like, okay, well, I need to dynamically reduce the vote count. That service happens to be over there right now. What if, in this situation, Toonces 01 just disappears? Now, I mentioned that in the case of a shutdown, it should attempt to hand off the votes, but what if it's not a Windows shutdown? What if there's a major power outage? Or what if Toonces 01's network connection just fails? It could be a variety of different things. It could be a virtual machine over there and just suddenly who knows what happens. It's just not available right now. Well, our availability group is active on Toonces 02. Let's simulate this. So in my lab environment, and if you set up this in a lab environment, it can be really simple and easy to do this yourself and test what happens to my quorum if. I go into the properties for my virtual machine for Toonces 01, and I say, oh, your network connection it's just gone, and I make that take effect immediately. What happens to my quorum? On Toonces 02, I'm attempting to work in the Failover Cluster Manager. I want to connect to Cluster 01, and it's attempting to connect Cluster 01, but then it cannot connect. And this is one of the things that when you're working with anything that relies on a Windows cluster, if the cluster is having major issues, you may not be able to connect to the cluster and get information from the cluster manager if the cluster is not properly online. And you need to make sure that you're used to that and know how to troubleshoot it, and that you have processes where you can look at other things to find out information. One place where there's often very good information is the Windows event log. And in this case, if we look at the Windows event log, I have to dig through different messages, but there's a message here that says the cluster service terminated with an error. We were not able to form quorum. We lost quorum. And this can be hard to understand, but it has to do with the type of failure that it was, as well as the dynamic voting. We had not provided a witness. So the Windows cluster said, okay, well, we'll give Toonces 01 the vote. It was not a graceful shutdown. There was a sudden network error. So the resource that had the vote is suddenly gone. Toonces 02, it had SQL Server Online, but it has 0 votes out of 2. It does not know if maybe something else is going on. It does not have a majority. It cannot attain quorum. It needs to shut down for safety. There are ways that you can respond to this and get SQL Server back online by working with the cluster, but you need to actually, practice this and respond to it and get good at it, and ideally also configure a witness so that you have 3 votes and it doesn't have to dynamically reduce your vote count like this, right? So you can do preventive medicine, but I also very much believe in practicing and making sure, okay, if I did end up in this situation, what would I do? Because we need to know how to get out of here. Takeaways for dynamic quorum. I love the dynamic quorum feature, but make sure you're really configuring quorum properly with the right number of votes and that you're using a witness when you should use a witness. We're going to talk more about witness next. Whenever you have anything in your cluster fail, like if you're reconfiguring your cluster, you're changing your node count, or doing work of any means, always stop and ask, do I have the right quorum? If anything at all has changed, it should be a relatively quick check. And know that dynamic quorum isn't going to just, solve everything that could take your SQL Server offline. It has to make sure that you're not having things online in multiple places and corrupting your data. Also, type of failure matters. Don't just test planned shutdowns, right? Planned shutdowns are a little different than network failures. Next feature, dynamic witness. Now, dynamic witness was added in Windows Server 2012 R2. So this feature doesn't exist prior to that. Dynamic witness, it helps us out in situations like this. So let's say I have a 3-node cluster. Maybe it's an availability group. Maybe I have 2 nodes in my primary site and 1 node, in another site that's nearby, good network connection to it. And there's really reliable connections, and I want to let them all have votes. Each of my nodes has 1 out of 3 votes of the node votes. If I configure a witness, is that a problem? Because if I configure a witness, that's a total of 4 votes. Right? And 4 is an odd number. What if 2 nodes can't suddenly see the other 2 nodes? I might have a tie situation, and that's not attractive. To help with this, the dynamic witness feature means that Windows can look at this and be like, okay, well, you got 3 votes over there. That's an odd number, and that's really nice. So for now, you have a witness configured, but I'm not actually going to give it a vote right now. Now, if Toonces 03 shuts down and is offline, then you'll have 2 votes, and maybe I will want to use the witness and dynamically turn it on. So dynamic witness is great because, okay, I've got 3 nodes. You always want to make the decision as to whether you want to allow them to have votes based on their connectivity and location to one another and what types of failover you're using. But if you want to use all 3 of those votes, the dynamic witness feature is fantastic because it will use your witness when you need it. Yeah. Kind of just easier to configure. But as with everything else, this can be a little trickier than you think too. There's always something, right? So let's see how we configure the witness. Back in the Failover Cluster Manager, we go over to that right panel and say More Actions. We click on that and say I want to configure cluster quorum. And this time we specify the middle option. and say, I want to configure the quorum witness and use that. Over here, we say, yep, I want to use a file share witness. Now, a note on this. You can use what's called a disk witness. If you're using a failover cluster that uses shared storage, where the storage has to be accessible to both nodes, traditionally you used a disk witness, and you still actually want to do that. If you have shared storage for a failover cluster, don't just use a file share because you can provision some storage to act as a disk witness, because actually it's a little bit of extra functionality and can get a little more information. So don't always use a file share witness if you have shared storage as part of a failover cluster witness. In this case, we have an availability group with totally separate storage, and we aren't using any shared storage, so we're going to go ahead and do a file share witness. We tell it where the file share witness is, and in this case, I'll admit it, it's in a very bad location because this is a demo server. I put it on my domain controller. Don't put it on your domain controller. But I will admit that Gates01 is the name of the domain controller because it's a crazy test environment. And next, we say, okay, yeah, I want to go ahead and configure Quorum like this. So now that I've configured Quorum, at the, there's the health of the witness is now reported at the bottom of my screen under the cluster core resources, and it says it's online and it's green. Now, what if something happens to my witness? You can actually right-click the witness and simulate failure, but I'm actually going to say, I'm not even going to, I want to know what if the witness fails, but I want to make sure that I don't fall prey to some issue in the simulation. What if my witness was gone? And one way that I can do this is go over to the place that the file share is and just simulate what happens if you lost permissions. So this is a very devious thing to do. I'm not saying you should do this in your production environment, but you can test in your test environment and say, okay, cluster01 is the name of the account that it's using, right? And I have gone into the properties of the share and denied permissions to it. And it is, Windows is like, hey, do you really want to do this? By the way, deny trumps grant. Yep, that's exactly what I want. I want to simulate this failure. And now the cluster, back in the cluster manager, it's like, oh yeah, your file share witness has failed. This is no longer accessible. All right, well, so I don't have a file share witness. Is it smart enough to remove the vote for that? And I always expected actually that it would remove the vote for that in every situation, because when you read about the dynamic witness feature, it basically says that the feature is designed to recognize when the witness has failed, but it is a little complex. If we go into the log, this is the cluster event, you'll see it does completely recognize that it failed. It's not just a red X for no reason. The cluster resource has failed, and it will try, to kind of see if it'll work. You should check it out. But when I go back and I look at my nodes, I don't see what I'd expect, because if the vote for my witness was removed, right, then I would have 2 votes total. In that case, dynamic quorum should kick in, right? And dynamic quorum is like 2 votes is an even number, and an even number is not safe, and I should get at least one of these to have a current vote of 0. But in this case, I look over here, and the current vote for both of them is still 1, as if I have 3 votes total. But I only have 2 out of 3 votes. We can further confirm. Now, I'm looking at current vote for nodes here. This GUI does not display. There's no place in here where I can be like, okay, what is my witness's current vote? But I can do that through PowerShell. The PowerShell for this uses the Get-Cluster commandlet and checks witness dynamic weight. And when I run that and check it, hey, my witness dynamic weight is 1. It has not been reduced to 0. I will say at this point, this feature does work. You'll see that this is related to my current node count. When there are more nodes, you can run this exact same scenario and run this, and it will properly set witness dynamic weight to 0. This is happening because my cluster only has 2 nodes, and part of why you can see that is if you look at the cluster's internal logs, you can see more information about what's going on. So I've run another PowerShell command, the Get-ClusterLog commandlet. has some really nice options, some of which are specific to your version of SQL Server. You can't use all these options in every version of, version of Windows. It's rough. Version of Windows Failover Cluster, because this is not talking to the SQL Server, right? This is talking to Windows Cluster. This is always so tricky because you're like, which technology am I speaking with? So we want specific, just recent events, and I love this one. I want to make sure that I'm looking at it in my own time span, and then I went ahead and wrote it to the S drive, to the cluster log drive, and it goes ahead and dumps that log out there. And when I open the log, you can dig through it and see different messages about what's going on, and it says, you know what, I actually, with this node count, I can't reduce the witness weight, and yeah, I don't want to go below 3. So with this number of nodes, my witness failing doesn't do exactly what I would expect from the documentation. I am not that upset about this. The reason I am not upset about this is because it's going to stink either way, right? Like, okay, right now with this failed, I have 2 votes and 2 out of 3 votes. And yes, if there's a network interruption between the nodes, things can go offline. That's not good. But it's also not good to have 1 vote out of 2 votes, and right, because I already showed you that 1 vote out of 2 votes, a network interruption can also cause things to go offline. You could make different arguments that one is worse than the other, but the fact is neither of them is good and neither of them is attractive. So the node count does matter. Don't think that dynamic witness, if you have 2 nodes in a cluster, will necessarily, like, if the witness fails, that dynamic voting will then reduce vote count to 1, because every time I have observed this, that doesn't happen, and many times I've run through this, it happens like I show it here. But I actually don't, I think any failed witness is just bad, right? In any case of a failed witness, it's not like if dynamic witness works differently, you should leave the witness failed. No. If any witness fails, your cluster is at greater risk of losing quorum, and you need to make sure that you're monitoring all of the cluster logs, and if any part of the cluster is failed, that you go in, look at the situation, and make a decision on how you can fix that as soon as possible. In the case of a witness failed, you could recreate a different witness. You could bring, maybe you just bring the file share back online, whatever has happened to make the witness unavailable. You do want a reliable witness, right? So monitoring is really, really key, and dynamic witness doesn't change that. Monitoring is still very, very key. I'm really excited about the dynamic witness feature, though, because a lot of times we don't just have 2 nodes, especially with an availability group. One of the big reasons that people go into that is they want to have 1 node for failover and then another node for scale-out reads. And, you're already above the 2 node count there, right? So more and more situations that we want to set SQL Server up, and we do have these larger node counts in the cluster, and the dynamic witness feature is absolutely meaningful. Just don't think it's necessarily going to save everything in a small node state. So takeaways for witnesses: monitor, monitor, monitor. Like Steve Ballmer, developers, 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 monitor, monitor, monitor. And if you are using a traditional failover cluster with shared storage, don't get too distracted by my demo showing that file share witness. You still have reasons that in a failover cluster with shared storage, you would use a shared quorum disk and not a file share for your witness. So let's take a look at 3 different real-world scenarios and how I've said a lot about dynamic witness and dynamic quorum. What does this all mean? Let's take a look at 3 different scenarios. Now, this isn't every scenario you're going to hit, but it is 3 different scenarios. There's a traditional 2-node failover cluster. So SQL Server on a failover cluster instances, there are 2 nodes. And one of the cool things about this is with SQL Server, you can actually do, and a lot of folks don't know this, you can actually do a 2-node failover cluster with SQL Server Standard Edition. You don't have to have Enterprise Edition to cluster SQL Server. Now, you're limited on how many nodes, but it's still pretty cool for the price of Standard Edition. So for this, we're kind of running an old school scenario here. got SQL Server 2012 Standard Edition, but we're on a really pretty old version of Windows, Windows 2008 R2. That does have the failover clustering feature in the Enterprise Edition of Windows. This has changed over time. They have moved failover clustering in later versions of Windows into Windows Standard Edition. In this case, I would configure nodes plus quorum disk. It's 3 votes total. We do not get dynamic voting. We do not get dynamic witness. We have a lot, if this is a new install, we have a lot of patches to research. Windows Server 2008 R2 is kind of an old operating system, and the failover clustering feature is part of Windows. So we need to make sure that we have not just the latest service pack, because the latest service pack came out a really long time ago, but that we research fixes that came out after the patches and all of the different things that might impact it, because there are some critical fixes that come out of there, and there's no big patch roll-up for you. So not an ideal situation, but it can work, right? And if you have an existing one of these and it's working well, you may not have a reason to change it very much. Second scenario, a 2-replica availability group. SQL Server 2012, so not the latest and greatest, 2 replicas using synchronous and automatic failover. Windows Server 2008 R2 Enterprise Edition using local solid-state storage on each node for speed. Now, for the quorum question for this, you would do node votes plus a file share witness. You don't have shared storage in this scenario, so it's not like you're going to use a disk witness, and you want that odd number of votes, especially because you're on Windows Server 2008 R2 and you don't have, dynamic quorum, right? I am not excited about this scenario, and for new installations, I would absolutely not recommend it. In terms of performance and availability, there have been many, many improvements. And also, one thing to really know, this also goes for the failover cluster in the last slide too, but when you're going live on an availability group, it's particularly useful to know, there is no upgrade path for, I wanted the pin, there we go, so on this slide, there is no upgrade path for this cluster. Windows Server 2008 R2 cluster running SQL Server cannot be upgraded in place to Windows Server 2012. The way to do it is to build a new cluster that's Windows Server 2012 and migrate to it. So because of all of the bugs, and that Windows Server 2008 R2 is a really old operating system. We've had 2 versions since then, right? Not just one, we've had 2. Because of all of those issues, I would not recommend this for how to move into availability groups in a new way. Look really, really closely at that, because the clustering component is incredibly important, and it's had major improvements in recent versions. So pay really close attention to that, and don't just use an older operating system because you feel like you're more familiar with it. The combination of how SQL Server communicates with the cluster and all sorts of ways availability groups work do change the game up a bit. And the third scenario, a 3-replica availability group. This is SQL Server 2012, AlwaysOn Availability Group. And I should mention that the scenarios are all talking about 2012, but SQL Server 2014 actually does add new features to AGs, which are very attractive. In particular, how it behaves, how read-only replicas behave if there's a network connection has changed significantly in a good way. In this one, we're kind of running the old school, though. We're SQL Server 2012. We got 3 replicas. 2 are in synchronous mode for automatic failover. We have another over on our disaster recovery site. And that one's asynchronous. We're only going to fail over to it manually. And our connection to the DR site occasionally is periodically iffy. Now this, especially if we have a high workload, this can be a real challenge, because we have to be able, even asynchronous, we have to be able to get that data over there. So if there's long periods where the connection is really slow or is down, this may cause us problems on our primary replica, because it has to ship that data over there. But in this case, it's just like periodically there's an occasional interruption. And we've decided that we actually want to remove the vote on that DR site. We're going to really monitor things heavily and make sure it doesn't get too far behind. We're going to be really careful, but we have decided that we want to give 2 votes to the 2 replicas in the primary site, and also give a vote to a witness in the primary site using a file share, and we are going to manually remove the vote, which you can do in that cluster manager, in the disaster recovery site for that node, so that it is not part of the vote count. We have 3 votes total, 2 nodes in the primary site, and then our file share. And that is totally doable and very, very easy to do. As I said, monitoring is still really important if you have any kind of network interruptions to a replica. For more information, we've got a lot of stuff on clustering at brentozar.com/go/cluster. And the things that I think that you should really take away from this talk are on this slide. But the one I really want to focus on here is that don't take my word about how any of this stuff works. The big takeaway for you here is that if you're doing anything with a failover cluster, or if you want to do anything with a failover cluster, set a test environment and make these things fail yourself. So to recap the kind of failure I showed you and what I want you to do, set up Quorum and do network connections or network connection failures on different nodes that are part of the cluster. Watch how it reacts and practice fixing it. Right? That was example one, was network failure. Make your file share witness fail. Test that. Test all sorts of different failure scenarios as well as how you would fix it. That helps you know, what do I do when things go wrong? How exactly does this work? And can my team handle this? Because you don't want to be in a situation where you've lost Quorum and you don't know how to react, where your high availability solution is causing you downtime. So that's exactly like what I want to inspire you to do, is go out there and make it fail. I actually think it's really, really fun. And check into how you go ahead and fix it. So all right, switching back to the GoToWebinar, let's see what kinds of questions we've got. And I will have to, there we go, let's see if I can get the slide going and my mouse back, which is always a fun challenge. There we go, all right. So different questions. If we create, Cole has a question, if we create a file share as a witness, should we have 2 votes to keep the availability group up and running? All right, so Cole, whether or not you, on Windows Server 2012, Microsoft's advice is actually that you always configure a witness, because dynamic witness will help it determine whether it needs that vote. The other guidance is, if you're not running Windows Server 2012 R2, you basically want to make sure that you always have an odd number of votes. So the guidance on whether or not to create a file share witness actually varies depending on whether or not you're running Windows Server 2012 R2, if that makes sense. Totally ask a follow-up question if you want. All right, so Cole also asked, can we have 2 NICs, one for availability groups and one for the cluster service? Is this recommended to avoid a single point of failure? Fantastic question. Brent Ozar, who's part of my team, he wrote this great post called "Everything You Know About Windows Clustering is Wrong," and it's true, everything I know about Windows clustering is wrong. But one of the things he points out in there is you absolutely want to have 2 physical NICs, and when you run cluster verification, it will look and try to figure out if you have 2 physical NICs, which in a virtual environment, it can't always tell what the hosts have, so you may get a warning in a virtual environment. You always want to make sure that either the host or, depending on whether you're virtual, or the SQL Server itself, the cluster member does have 2 physical NICs, so that if any NIC fails, you're not just down, but you don't have to actually set up networks separately. Used to, the advice with clusters was that you set up this separate heartbeat network, and it was kind of complex in a network way. It is totally supported for you to have 2 physical NICs and just team them, and use that team so that cluster communications as well as application communications can all work with the team. It's a simpler networking setup, and it protects you from that single point of failure, and it is totally supported by the Windows team. The cluster validation really wants to make sure you don't have one single physical point of failure. All right, so question about what I think is about this slide. So Karthik, I think if the 3rd node is in a different data center, the node vote would be 0, so we would still have 2 nodes configure if the witness fails, right? Yes, on the scenario that I have on, I think that, let me go back to the previous slide, actually. There we go. In this scenario, if I remove the vote in the remote site, and I've got 2 nodes in the primary site and a file share witness in the primary site, I have 3 votes. If the file share witness fails, I am going to be in a bad situation. That's absolutely true. Totally true. Yeah, but I would argue that even with the vote and even if I gave it a vote in the DR site and the witness failed, I would still be in a bad situation because the network connection is unreliable. If the connection to the DR site is trouble-free, I'm going to be much happier, right? I'm honestly on this slide. I like to talk about this example because it's a real-world thing, but this I don't like having an availability group where I might have issues because if I can't sync to that replica and it gets really far behind, it can impact the transaction log on my primary replica, and then can I catch it up? Do I have to rebuild it? You know, that's no fun. That's rough. All right. What if you have 3 availability groups nodes in one data center? Would you still set up a file share witness? That's Steve's question. Yeah, so Steve, if you're running Windows Server 2012 R2 and you have 3 nodes in one data center, I would configure a file share witness, and dynamic witness would mean it would say, hey, I've got three votes. I don't need to use you right now, but if I lose one of these guys, I'll pull you into play. If you're not on Windows 2012 R2, you want to focus on getting that odd amount of votes. Yeah. Mark points out, Teams NIC does not protect you from someone using a duplicate IP on the network. That could be a single point of failure. Oh yeah, this is a great point. Like, just when you think you're safe, I haven't demonstrated everything that can mess with you. And duplicate IPs on the network absolutely can cause major chaos. This isn't just true to high availability, it's true to other things too, but it can still absolutely cause major problems with the high availability solution too. So now Karthik says Windows 10 might help you as you can place a file share in the cloud. File share, now be careful. File share placement is really important, and essentially when you're thinking about placing a witness, typically you're going to always put it in your primary data center because you want communication between your primary nodes and that file share witness to be really, really rock solid. And if I'm putting it up in the cloud, how reliable is my communication to it? So I totally get why you would think this, and you're like, maybe an independent location is better. Typically, making it be in a local data center where you're going to be able to be assured of communication between the primary nodes and that witness is possible. You only get one witness. Unfortunately, you can't have 2. There are ways that you can make a file share highly available even in your own data center. There's actually Windows technologies around that where you could work towards making your file shares highly available too. So you could even do that in your own data center. That's a great question though, because a lot of folks are like, okay, where do I put it? Typically the primary site is the best. And we have another question. Similarly, I have a setup with, and I think if I'm reading it right, in the primary site you have one node, you have the witness and the secondary in the DR site. Yeah, I think you could have an issue with that because if you have a network partition between the sites and your primary replica now doesn't see either your witness or your secondary, it loses, quorum and it shuts down, and hopefully in your secondary site the other node can see the witness, but then you're maybe having a failover you don't want, right? Typically failing over between sites is a pretty big deal and you don't want it. Even if automatic failover is okay, you want to avoid it. So that could be an issue. All right. So John says, Brent, thank you so much. You're welcome. I love it when people call me Brent. I take that as a compliment. All righty. So I think we have reached the end of the questions today, unless Ed, do you know of any questions that I don't know about? I think I've answered all.
I think that'll do it.
Getting it here.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for presenting. That was awesome.
And you know what? My audio may not be working. One moment.
Nope, we can hear you just fine.
I could not hear what I'm sorry if you spoke earlier and I couldn't hear you. My audio dynamically voted to turn off.
That's awesome. No, I think that'll do it. So thank you for presenting, and thank all of you for attending this awesome session, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks so much, Ed.
Cool. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.